At first, time could still be counted, measured by routines and familiar signals. But as days repeated without change and nothing arrived to separate one moment from the next, time quietly lost its direction and its weight until the men no longer felt themselves moving through days at all, but simply remaining inside them, unsure when one had ended, when another had begun, or whether counting still served any purpose. In the earliest phase, time had not yet disappeared because it still arrived with markers that felt dependable enough to trust. Mornings were separated from evenings by light, by routine, and by the repeated movements that gave each day a recognizable outline. Even inside confinement, the men could still sense progression because one day followed another in a sequence that seemed intact. Time moved forward, even if it moved slowly, and that forward motion gave structure to endurance. The camp reinforced this perception through order. Roll calls, meals, work periods, and rest created divisions that suggested continuity with a world beyond the wire. These divisions allowed the prisoners to organize their thoughts, to remember yesterday as something distinct from today, and to imagine tomorrow as a separate space not yet occupied. Time, during this stage, still behaved as expected, moving from one point to the next without folding in on itself. Men relied on these markers to maintain orientation. They counted days, not obsessively, but confidently, believing that accumulation mattered. Each completed day felt like progress, not toward freedom necessarily, but toward resolution of some kind. Time was still treated as something that could be endured in portions, broken down into manageable units that, once survived, could be set aside. Memory functioned clearly during this period. Events stood apart from one another, and recalling when something had occurred did not require effort. Conversations referenced specific days, specific moments, and shared recollections reinforced the sense that time remained orderly. Even monotony did not yet threaten clarity, because repetition had not reached the point where days blended together. Emotion followed this structure. Frustration and hope both relied on time behaving predictably. Frustration existed because delays were noticeable, and hope persisted because delays implied eventual movement. The men still expected time to deliver change, even if that change arrived slowly or without explanation. Waiting was tolerated because it was measured. The body aligned itself with this understanding. Energy was managed with an eye toward duration rather than permanence. Fatigue was temporary, rest was restorative, and effort was distributed across the day with the assumption that tomorrow would resemble today but remain distinct from it. The future, though uncertain, still felt reachable through the passage of days. Importantly, identity remained linked to time in a familiar way. A man understood himself as someone moving through an experience, not someone contained within a static condition. Time provided narrative, allowing life to feel like a sequence rather than a suspension. Captivity was framed as a chapter rather than an environment, and time was the thread holding that chapter together. Yet even in this early stage, subtle inconsistencies began to appear. Some days felt longer without reason, others shorter despite identical routines. Small gaps emerged between expectation and experience, unnoticed at first because they did not yet disrupt the larger structure. Time still worked, but it required more attention to trust. These early distortions did not alarm the men because the framework remained intact. They continued to count, to remember, and to anticipate, confident that time, though slowed, remained reliable. What they did not yet recognize was that this reliability depended on contrast, and contrast was slowly being worn away by repetition that offered no variation strong enough to preserve distinction. For now, time could still be counted, and counting gave meaning to endurance. Each day completed reinforced the belief that time mattered, that passing through it achieved something, even if the destination remained unclear. This belief sustained the men through the early period, allowing them to remain oriented, present, and psychologically intact, unaware that the very mechanisms they relied upon were beginning to weaken under the weight of days that no longer introduced anything new. If you'd like to hear future stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel. As repetition continued without interruption, the divisions that once separated one day from the next began to soften. The same routines returned to the same hours, and the same movements were repeated with such precision that variation became difficult to detect. What had once served as markers now reinforced sameness, and the mind, deprived of contrast, struggled to preserve clear boundaries between moments that felt increasingly identical. Men noticed this change first in small ways. Recalling whether something had happened the previous day or several days earlier required effort, and conversations occasionally stalled as memories failed to anchor themselves to a specific time. Events were remembered, but their placement drifted, floating free of dates or sequence. The past did not vanish, but it lost its order, making it harder to trace a line from what had been to what was. Counting days became less reliable under these conditions. Numbers accumulated, but they no longer carried weight because adding one more to a growing total did not alter experience. A completed day felt no different from an unfinished one, and the act of counting gradually shifted from confidence to habit. Some men continued out of discipline, while others stopped without noticing, realizing that the numbers no longer clarified anything. Memory adapted by compressing experience. Instead of storing individual days, the mind grouped them into stretches, recalling weeks as single impressions rather than sequences. This compression reduced mental strain because tracking every repetition demanded energy that endurance required elsewhere. By allowing days to merge, the mind protected itself from overload, even as it surrendered precision. Emotion adjusted alongside memory. Anticipation weakened, because anticipation depends on difference, on the belief that tomorrow will not mirror today exactly. As days blurred, expectation lost its shape, and with it went much of the tension that had once accompanied waiting. This easing did not bring relief so much as neutrality, a steady emotional state that made persistence possible without constant evaluation. The body responded as well. Fatigue became harder to attribute to a specific cause because effort was evenly distributed across time rather than concentrated in identifiable moments. Rest no longer refreshed in the way it once had because recovery assumed progress, and progress was no longer apparent. Physical sensation flattened, mirroring the mental experience of days that no longer stood apart. Within the barracks, shared time dissolved into parallel existence. Men occupied the same space, followed the same schedule, and moved together through routines, yet their sense of when things occurred diverged. Conversations rarely referenced specific days anymore, focusing instead on immediate observations. Time, once communal, became individual, experienced privately rather than collectively. The camp itself offered no correction for this drift. Its consistency, once reassuring, now accelerated the blur by providing no variation strong enough to reset perception. Every day arrived already familiar, and familiarity made it harder to register arrival at all. The structure remained flawless, but flawlessness removed distinction, allowing time to flatten. By this stage, days still existed, but their edges had worn thin. Morning and evening could be identified, but yesterday and tomorrow felt less certain. The men did not feel lost, but they felt unanchored, moving through a present that stretched outward without clear reference points. Time had not stopped, but it had begun to lose definition, setting the conditions for a deeper shift where even the idea of duration would start to dissolve. What remained was continuity without clarity. The days continued to pass, but passing no longer meant progressing, and remembering no longer meant ordering. This quiet erosion did not announce itself as a problem because it reduced strain rather than increasing it. Yet in doing so, it marked the beginning of a more profound change, where time would no longer function as a sequence to be endured, but as a continuous state to be inhabited. As the days continued to blur, time began to feel lighter, not because it moved faster, but because it carried less significance. The prisoners no longer experienced time as something pressing forward or dragging behind them. Instead, it hovered, present but unmarked, no longer demanding attention or effort to endure. Without clear boundaries, time stopped feeling like a force acting upon them and became something they existed inside, quiet and constant. This change altered how effort was perceived. When days had weight, effort felt purposeful because it occupied a defined space within time. Now, effort dissolved into routine without leaving an impression. Work was done, rest was taken, and movement continued, but none of it accumulated toward anything recognizable. Actions no longer felt stored in memory as achievements or failures. They simply occurred and then faded, leaving no trace strong enough to measure. The mind responded by releasing its grip on duration. Hours were no longer tracked internally, and moments stretched or contracted without notice. A task might feel brief one day and endless the next, without any difference in its actual length. This inconsistency did not cause distress, because the expectation of consistency had already weakened. Time was no longer expected to behave predictably, and without that expectation, its irregularities felt natural. Emotions softened further under these conditions. Without time to frame experience, feelings lacked momentum. Anger did not build, hope did not rise, and disappointment did not linger. Emotional responses appeared briefly and then passed, unreinforced by memory or anticipation. This flattening did not eliminate feeling, but it reduced intensity, creating a steady internal environment that allowed survival without exhaustion. Memory continued to adjust. Instead of recalling experiences by when they happened, the men remembered them by how they felt physically or emotionally. Sensations replaced sequences, and impressions replaced timelines. A moment was remembered because it stood out internally, not because it occurred on a particular day. Time no longer organized memory. Memory reorganized itself around impact rather than order. The body mirrored this shift. Hunger, fatigue, and discomfort appeared without clear relation to time of day, rising and falling independently of schedule. Sleep arrived when exhaustion permitted it, not when the clock suggested it. Physical rhythms detached from temporal structure, aligning instead with immediate need. This detachment further weakened the connection between experience and measured time. Interactions among the prisoners reflected the same change. References to duration became vague, replaced by expressions that described condition rather than sequence. Someone felt tired, restless, or numb, but rarely spoke of how long these states had lasted. Time-based language lost relevance because duration no longer clarified experience. What mattered was not how long something had persisted, but whether it was present now. The camp offered no resistance to this transformation. Its routines continued unchanged, but their ability to define time had diminished. The same signals arrived, but they no longer anchor perception. Time passed, but passing no longer meant anything specific. The structure remained, but its meaning dissolved. By this stage, Time had lost its weight. It no longer pressed against the men or pulled them forward. It existed quietly, without urgency or demand, allowing life to continue without the constant awareness of duration. This lightness made endurance easier, but it also marked a significant loss, because when time no longer matters, neither does progress. The men remained present, functioning within a moment that neither advanced nor retreated, unaware that this shift was preparing them for a deeper dissolution, where even the sense of being inside time would begin to fade. As time lost its weight, the present expanded to fill everything that remained. There was no longer a clear sense of moving from one moment into the next, only the experience of staying where they already were. The men did not feel trapped inside a single instant, but they did feel surrounded by it, as if the present had stretched outward until it no longer pointed anywhere else. Without contrast, moments stopped announcing themselves, and existence settled into a continuous state that required no transition. This endless present altered attention. The mind no longer scanned ahead or reached backward, because neither direction offered useful reference. Instead, awareness settled on what was immediately available: the sound of movement nearby, the pressure of the ground beneath the body, the steady rhythm of breathing. These details did not stand out as meaningful, but they provided texture, allowing experience to continue without demanding interpretation. Attention became shallow but wide, spread evenly across the moment rather than focused on outcomes. Decision-making changed under these conditions. When the future no longer felt distinct, choices lost urgency. Selecting one action over another did not appear to lead anywhere different, and without perceived consequence, decision became a matter of convenience rather than intention. This did not result in confusion, but in simplicity, because fewer decisions meant fewer internal conflicts. The present asked little, and giving little became the most efficient response. Language adapted as well. Words that implied sequence or duration fell out of use internally, replaced by descriptions of state rather than movement. A man felt tired or calm, restless or still, without connecting those sensations to how long they had lasted or when they might end. Time-based thinking no longer structured experience, because the present did not suggest departure. Everything that mattered existed now, and now did not move. Emotion adjusted to this containment. Without anticipation, emotional peaks could not form, and without memory anchored in sequence, emotional lows did not accumulate. Feelings appeared and faded within the same moment, rarely gaining enough momentum to dominate awareness. This created a steady emotional field that was neither positive nor negative, but sustainable. The men did not feel relieved or distressed by this shift. They simply inhabited it. The body mirrored the same pattern. Movements became economical, conserving energy without planning. Fatigue was managed as it arose, hunger acknowledged when present, discomfort adjusted to rather than resisted. Physical experience aligned fully with the present, responding to signals without projecting them forward. This alignment reduced strain because the body was no longer asked to prepare for anything beyond what it was already experiencing. Interactions among the prisoners reflected this shared condition. They occupied the same space and moved through the same routines, yet their connection was based on proximity rather than shared narrative. Conversation, what occurred, referred to immediate circumstances, not to past events or future possibilities. The present provided all the context required, making extended explanation unnecessary. The camp itself remained unchanged, but its role shifted. It no longer structured time so much as it maintained continuity. The routines did not mark progress or regression. They simply sustained the present state. The system did not need to evolve because nothing inside it demanded change. The present persisted, supported by repetition and reinforced by the absence of temporal markers that could challenge it. By this stage, the men were no longer aware of waiting or counting or even enduring time. They existed inside and extended now that neither advanced nor concluded. This was not experienced as stagnation, but as stability, a condition where effort, memory, and expectation had all narrowed to fit the present moment. The endless present did not announce itself as a loss, but it quietly replaced the structure that time once provided, preparing the way for a final adjustment, where even awareness of the present would begin to soften into something quieter and less defined. By the final stage, even the awareness of the present began to soften. The men no longer experienced time as something they were inside of, because being inside implied boundaries, and boundaries had quietly dissolved. There was no effort required to remain present, and no effort required to escape it. Experience flowed without resistance, unmeasured and unremarked, as if time itself had stepped aside and allowed life to continue without supervision. Thought slowed in a particular way, not into confusion, but into simplicity. The mind no longer asked where it was in the day or how long something had lasted, because those questions no longer produced useful answers. Instead, thought followed sensation briefly and then released it, moving on without attachment. Awareness became lighter, less insistent, and less concerned with continuity. Moments did not connect to form narratives. They existed independently and then faded. Emotion followed the same quiet pattern. Feelings appeared without urgency and disappeared without consequence. There was no buildup, no release, and no sense of emotional progression. The men did not feel empty, but they did feel unburdened by expectation. Without time to amplify experience, emotion remained shallow and manageable, allowing endurance without strain. Life continued at a steady internal temperature, neither rising nor falling. The body adapted completely to this condition. Physical needs were addressed when they appeared and forgotten when they passed. Hunger, fatigue, and discomfort were no longer interpreted as signals of duration or deprivation, but as transient states that required response only in the moment. The body did not prepare, remember, or anticipate. It reacted and then settled again. This responsiveness without projection reduced friction, making survival automatic rather than effortful. Interaction with others became similarly minimal. Presence replaced engagement. Men existed alongside one another without comparison or expectation, sharing space without needing to define relationship. There was no sense of distance or closeness, only coexistence. The absence of temporal awareness removed the need to situate oneself relative to others, because sequence and progression no longer structured social experience. The camp continued its routines, but their meaning had changed entirely. They no longer marked time, reinforced order, or suggested continuity. They simply occurred, like weather patterns that passed through without requiring interpretation. The system functioned, and the men functioned within it, without either side demanding explanation or recognition. Time no longer mediated this relationship. It had become irrelevant. In this state, endurance no longer felt like an action. It did not require patience, strength, or intention. It existed as a condition, sustained automatically by the absence of alternatives. The men did not feel as though they were surviving each day. They simply found themselves still present at the end of it, without recalling how they had arrived there. By the end of this phase, time had not stopped, but it had withdrawn from experience. The men lived without measuring, without marking, and without feeling the passage that once defined their existence. What remained was continuity without awareness, a quiet persistence that required no acknowledgement. Waiting had transformed into something deeper than habit, and time, having lost its function, no longer needed to be felt at all. In the end, there was no clear moment when time disappeared because nothing announced its departure. The days continued to arrive and pass in their usual way, and life inside the camp moved forward without interruption. What had changed was not the structure of the day, but the way it was experienced, lighter now, less demanding, no longer asking to be counted or understood. Time had once shaped every thought, marking progress, delay, and expectation. As it faded from awareness, those pressures dissolved with it. The men did not feel released from captivity, but they felt released from the effort of measuring it. Without the need to track or anticipate, endurance became quieter, carried by routine rather than intention. When they later tried to recall this period, it did not stand out as a sequence of days, but as a continuous stretch without edges. Time had not vanished, but it had stepped back, leaving behind a form of existence that moved without markers or milestones. In that quiet absence, the men learned that survival does not always depend on understanding how long something lasts, but on finding a way to live when time itself no longer asks to be felt. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.